pleasures, honestly, is working with folks like Muggs who have been doing a lot of implementation work in the context of their own research for many years and have expertise in HIV/AIDS, of course, but other folks that I work with in things like cancer, in mental health, in obesity, cardiovascular disease, lots of different spatial areas that I can bring methodologic expertise, but you still need partnerships with those folks who are content experts in both the actual disease area as well as the service context. So, obviously implementation science is taking the work that we do outside of laboratories and into communities. And so having people who know the community resources, know how those service systems work, as well as folks who are in the space of the actual disease area is really key to any implementation project being successful. So here's just a few of the hats that I wear. So you can see some drug abuse and HIV work. We have now a program in dissemination implementation science within our newly renewed CTSA at Northwestern called NewCats. I also chair the implementation science working group of NCI's Impact Research Consortium. So here's just basic conflict of interest disclosure, just a bunch of different funding sources, but nothing nefarious, I promise. So you'll see too, as I go through here, I've tried to inject a few elements of humor. They may fall flat, but I found it funny at one point in my life, so hopefully somebody else will find it funny too. So we're going to start out with some core concepts and definitions. So if anyone remembers, in 2001, the Institute of Medicine had this report that basically said there is not a research to practice gap, there's a research to practice chasm. It is so much worse basically than we had thought. Yeah, there's an automatic there. So everyone's probably also familiar too with this whole pipeline problem of it taking 17 years for discoveries and the development of new effective interventions to actually get into any sort of practice. The more disheartening piece of that is that only 14% of the interventions that we actually develop and show to be efficacious ever actually get to the real world. So it takes a long time and very few actually are ever successful in getting there. So here's just a couple of big context for why we do implementation science in the first place. So for those of you who this is new, I want to start very non-scientific, and I'll give credit to Jeff Curran for this, who came to fame largely because he was the lead author of the Hybrid Designs paper. He's a great guy, so I stole this slide from him with permission. So let's start non-scientific. The intervention, practice, or innovation is the thing. Effectiveness research looks at whether or not the thing works. D&I research looks at how best to help people and contexts, places, do the thing. And implementation strategies, which we study and are central to implementation research, are the stuff that we do to help people and places do the thing. And then implementation outcomes are how much and how well were they able to do the thing. So what's the thing? This is the thing is what you guys are all familiar with. So what we really kind of call the thing are Ps, or the 7 Ps. So these are evidence-based clinical and preventive interventions. So I used here examples from the HIV world, but you can probably replace this with pretty much any field in medicine, public health, or even social services. So there's things like pills, programs, practices, principles, products, policies, and procedures, all of which have evidence, of course, and that's why we're trying to move them out of kind of the research space and into real practice and get them scaled up, scaled out, et cetera. My next slide came from 2 weeks ago. I've been told to warn people that this particular talk is like drinking from a fire hose. So if you've seen this before, Peter says, "Nice job, Chris, you got my shirt wet." But basically, if you're able to kind of take away about 50% of what is said, that is definitely successful. So it's like normal to feel overwhelmed by this whole thing. And part of the problem that is overwhelming is there's a lot of new terminology. And some of that terminology is not as crystal clear as we'd like it to be. So let's start there, why not, right? So implementation research, I'm using NIH's definitions. There are different definitions for different groups. So the Knowledge Translation Group in Canada has a slightly different definition. The WHO has a different definition for international global work. Implementation science, the journal, God forbid, has a different definition themselves of what implementation research is. So, it's all kind of variations of the same thing, though. And what we're really talking about is the scientific study of the use of strategies. So again, the strategies are the key here. And those strategies help us to adopt and integrate evidence-based programs, health interventions, whatever, into clinical and community settings, with obviously the downstream ultimate goal of improving individual outcomes and benefiting population health. Implementation practice, which you'll hear a little bit today too, is the use of those strategies. Not necessarily to do research, but just actually putting those strategies into practice to, again, achieve the same kinds of goals as implementation research does downstream, which is population health and clinical outcomes. Implementation science is probably the top thing, the broad, big thing, which is just this field of study of methods. So implementation science is really just a methodologic field, and we study those methodologies. That's really the focus of the talk today, is all these methods that make up the field. Disclaimer, not a dissemination researcher. D&I, even though it's always lumped together, if you actually looked at the number of publications in dissemination versus implementation, the D would be very small and the I would be very tall. It's a very underdeveloped aspect of this field, but here's the definition according to NIH. It's the scientific study of targeted distribution of information and intervention materials. So it's not necessarily how do you actually do it, it's once you know what works, how do you get it out there and get it to the people who then can try to make it work. So I think it's not necessarily coincidental that dissemination often happens either in tandem or even before implementation does. Some folks will be familiar with this. This is just kind of placing the field of D&I within kind of the traditional translational pipeline. This is a variation of a figure that's probably been published multiple times now. I pulled this from Hendricks Brown's 2017 paper in ARPH. So basically, when we go through translational research, we do a lot of pre-intervention work, epidemiologic, developmental, surveillance kinds of data to figure out where the problem is, what would we want to target if we had to try to intervene and change things. So then we ask the question, okay, if we developed an intervention or a program, could it work? And that's when we do efficacy studies. They're really intended to show that it works. It's an explanatory study, right? Once we know that it works in that efficacy study, that it could work, we have to ask the question of, does the program work? And this is when we move into effectiveness studies. So we take it outside of a tightly controlled lab situation, lax a little bit into more realistic circumstances, but not perfectly real world yet. And we say, okay, does the program actually work under more real world circumstances? If we're able to show that it does, then we really get to this bigger question of how do we make the program work? We know that it can. We've probably still been providing a lot of resources and oversight during the effectiveness stage. But if we just kind of let it go, how do we actually make that program work? And this is where we enter into the dissemination and implementation side of things. So I'm going to go through this quick because I have a zoom in slide. So here's what it looks like a little bit closer. So taking effectiveness studies into the implementation space really requires kind of multiple things, and that's why this is a three-dimensional box. So at the front of the box, you have implementation practice. That's the folks on the ground who are actually going to implement, who try to actually pick up these programs and do the work. Way in the back on the top, you see that we have implementation researchers. And implementation researchers are trying to contribute to generalizable knowledge. We have study designs, we have approaches that are really trying to say, okay, this type of intervention in this type of setting for these type of people, this is a generalizable finding. Whereas implementation practitioners, when somebody picks up something off the shelf and tries to make it work in their clinic, they're not necessarily concerned or trying necessarily to answer a question that's applicable to anyone other than their clinic, or maybe a clinic that's very similar to them. So you might ask the question too, that's it. Sorry about that one. So people often ask, well, how does quality improvement fit into things? So quality improvement is typically done by implementation practitioners. They're concerned about a particular implementation or clinical gap in their local context that they want to figure out how to solve. Oftentimes, quality improvement can lead to generalizable knowledge, but it's not intended to necessarily. And that's why there's a kind of two-directional arrow here between generalizable and local, is that often to do CQI or to do quality improvement, we pull from the generalizable literature. Also, people who are developing studies to test generalizable knowledge, or to create generalizable knowledge, often pull from quality improvement studies, or actually do quality improvement studies to get preliminary pilot data. So here's another little fun thing, improvement science. Anybody heard of improvement science? Okay, so improvement science is another thing that came up recently that basically tries to pull the best of both worlds. It's the best of quality improvement, it's the best of dissemination and implementation science, and of course there's a new name. Also not an expert in this, other than I know that it exists, so don't ask me any hard questions about it. And then dissemination science is really all of this stuff. So it's the findings from effectiveness studies, it's the findings from quality improvement, it's findings from implementation research. All that stuff should be disseminated, and there's a whole field of science about how to do that, right? So I have this little thing over here too, this little orange box. I'll talk a little bit about this special case of effectiveness implementation hybrid designs, which really are this marrying of both addressing the aims of effectiveness studies as well as doing implementation work at the same time. And really that's a way of speeding translation, kind of skipping a step, or at least melding steps in the traditional pipeline to hopefully reduce that 17 years. By the way, you might have noticed that 17-year citation is from 1998. There's a more recent citation that basically redid it. Guess what? We haven't moved the needle. So unfortunately, even with our advances, at least it hasn't started to trickle down into actual published knowledge so far. So if there's anything that I can stress in this talk today, it's really that the delivery system is what matters in implementation. Sure, we're all interested in the evidence-based intervention, especially for an intervention developer. We have an investment in making sure that our intervention works and it shows our clinical outcomes, our favorite clinical outcome that we have. But when we move into implementation, we're really concerned about the delivery system itself. And I love this quote. I do this in every single talk. This is Dean Fixon and some folks from NERN, the National Implementation Research Network. They said the use of effective interventions without effective implementation strategies is like having a serum without the syringe. The cure is available, but the delivery system is not. So you could have the perfect thing, but if you can't get it to the people in the right place at the right time, it's not going to do anything. We all know that. But really, it's that focus on all those extra pieces outside of the serum itself that's really important. We'll come back to the serum and the syringe in a second for a hopefully not too clunky metaphor. So here's another kind of way of understanding this or thinking about it, that really the emphasis in implementation research versus effectiveness research. In effectiveness research, we're still mostly concerned with our evidence-based program, one of our 7 Ps. So the intervention is really at the forefront, which means in most effectiveness studies, not surprisingly, the thing we are really concerned with and we evaluate are health outcomes. Client functioning, symptomatology, incidence rates, things like that. And in effectiveness studies, there's always this system that supports adoption and delivery of fidelity, but it's not really talked much about. In fact, it usually gets a couple of sentences in an effectiveness study, like, oh yeah, we did it in X, Y, and Z place out in the community. Fantastic. But doesn't really tell you much about it. In implementation research, we flip the foreground background entirely. The evidence-based intervention sort of falls into the background. Great, we know if we deliver it with fidelity, it's going to be effective. How do we actually do that? So the system itself that supports that is what comes to the front. And because of that, it influences what we are going to measure, which is basically evaluating adoption, reach, fidelity, speed of delivery, cost of implementation support, all those kinds of metrics. It also influences what we might model, how we are going to test this, and also what we would evaluate. So how do we understand and explain why implementation succeeds or fails? And this is my little introduction to theories, models, and frameworks. So a great resource is this 2015 paper by Per Nilsson, who it's titled Making Sense of Implementation Theories, Models, and Frameworks. And it really is the best thing that we have in trying to tease apart all these different things. So he has this really great figure in his paper that basically has these kind of this broad umbrella of theoretical approaches that are used in implementation science. And he breaks them down into kind of 3 subcategories. One of which is how do we describe and or guide the process of translating evidence-based programs, and these are process models. The other side of things we have, how do we evaluate implementation, and then we use evaluation frameworks. And in the middle we have, how do we understand or explain what influences the implementation outcomes that we actually observe using our evaluation framework. And these are determinant frameworks, as well as classic theories, and then implementation theories. And so here's some examples from each. And we'll go into a little bit more detail, so I'm not going to go through too much of this. But determinant frameworks are often really basically focused on barriers to facilitators of implementation. It's the things that will either help or hurt your implementation. Process models specify stages or phases of implementation. And if you saw, I didn't talk about this, but in that 3-dimensional box, we showed EPIS, which is the exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment model. So it's a stage-based implementation process model that takes us from the very beginning of do we even need to implement a new practice, to we're going to implement, we need to prepare, to what does it look like while you're implementing, and then how do you sustain it. Evaluation frameworks, everyone's probably heard of REAM or Precede, Proceed. There's also the Proctor taxonomy, which I'll talk a little bit more about too. And then in classic theories, these are really theories that originated in other fields. So classic behavior change theories, organizational behavioral theories, social networks, diffusion of innovation, those sorts of things. And then we have implementation theories, which are really those that have developed within the field of implementation science to address specific questions to this field. So how do you select theories, models, and frameworks? This is always a challenge for folks who are writing grants in particular. How do you actually pick the one that's right for you? You're likely to use more than one because, as I explained in the previous slide, they serve different purposes. So you may use a determinant framework to really classify all the things in the context that are going to help or hurt you, a process model to dictate how you do it, and re-aim or some other kind of evaluation framework to actually figure out, did our implementation strategy have an impact? Don't create your own. That is, I should have underscored this. This is a big no-no, and part of the reason is there's more than 70. So there's no reason to do this. And you can adapt. I mean, people adapt constantly. That's totally fine, but basically the field has gotten to a place where innovation is no longer good in this particular place. So Rachel Tabak and colleagues, including Ross Brownson and some other folks, did a review of this back in 2012, and at that point there was, I think, 60-ish. Now there's much more than 70. And if you go to disseminationimplementation.org, you can have help selecting a framework or model by doing keyword searches. And so you can see here they talk about, are you looking at a framework that's about dissemination only, implementation and dissemination, different kinds of socio-ecological levels. Basically, are you trying to intervene at the individual provider level, at the organizational level? And so basically just clicking through these will give you a sense. Funny little anecdote, I did this the other day, and every time I did it, CFR came up. Like, it didn't matter what combination, it was like, CFR. Don't just say I'm going to use CFR for everything, because that will get you in trouble as well, because it's a determinant framework. It doesn't do more things. Or you can go to the article itself, and one of the appendices, Appendix A, which is actually like 5 pages long, has every single model and framework that they found, and all this nice coding. So this actually, I think, is more helpful than the algorithm in the search engine, to be totally honest, which is why I put it here. But they made this pretty little thing, so I figured I'd show it. So asking the question, what determines whether implementation succeeds or fails in a specific context? This is where we're talking about determinants. So this is really that barriers and facilitators. So again, here's our returning to the syringe. So it's not only about having a serum and a syringe, we have to think bigger. We have to think about all the other contextual factors that go into getting that serum into someone at the right place at the right time. So here's my clunky metaphor. So you potentially have this medical delivery truck taking your serum and syringes in those, God forbid, wooden boxes into the desert. Can anyone anticipate challenges just looking at our context here? Somebody tell me one thing that's potentially a challenge. Oh, thank you, temperature. Okay, so I have a little arrow pointing at the sun in a second.
Falling out of the truck.
That's possible. What other variables do we have to consider?
Running out of gas.
There, yep. So we have lots of different things. So we have this guy driving the truck. Is he competent? I say he's a guy just because I couldn't find any other good picture. But we also have the truck itself. So yeah, it runs out of gas. It doesn't have sufficient tires or suspension to deal with this crappy road that maybe is not maintained. And we also have temperature. So this is actually a real example of a vaccination that was developed that was tried to be distributed and disseminated into sub-Saharan Africa. And they realized they couldn't get it to the people because it was hundreds of miles of road that were crappy and no refrigerated trucks. And if the serum got above 74 degrees or something, it became ineffective. So it's all these different things. And you also have like this leadership and logistic people at the back end who are telling you how to actually do this. So they're telling the driver where to go, what to do, how to get this stuff happening. So it's a really multi-leveled system. And really this is basically the CFR model in picture. So the CFR model itself is factors that might prevent or enable improvements, which we often refer to as barriers and facilitators. These can, barriers and facilitators can also act as moderators, effect modifiers, mediators, as well as other pieces of a causal chain, and we'll give examples of that here in a second too. But here's a really nice picture of what CFR looks like. So let's dissect it a little bit. So you have 5 broad domains with a whole bunch of subdomains. So you have aspects of the intervention itself, so characteristics of the intervention. Does it have good strength and quality? Is there perceived relative advantage of this over other things? Can you adapt it? Is it trialable? Can you actually test whether it works? Is the design quality and packaging good? Is the cost within the realm of what's possible within your organization? You also have all these individuals involved. This is the guy driving the truck. It's the knowledge and belief about the intervention, the self-efficacy to deliver it, their own stage of change. Then you have the inner setting, which in our truck example is the truck itself, and potentially the company that runs the trucks. So you have structural characteristics, networks and communications, culture and climate. You have their readiness for implementation, leadership engagement, all these different aspects of what's happening within the inner system. Then you have the outer setting. which are things even beyond the direct service delivery. So you have things, the patient needs and resources in the community that you're serving, the cosmopolitanism of the organization, how well is it connected to other organizations? You have peer pressure. Is there potentially competition for delivering a particular service because others do it? And then external policies and incentives, and also things like payers, like was there reimbursement for these sorts of things? And then our last one is process. So don't confuse this with process models of implementation. This is really getting it kind of at the baseline or within a culture, within an organization. They typically have processes around planning, executing, reflecting, and evaluating their implementation, as well as do they routinely engage opinion leaders, champions, internal and external change agents. So how do we change the system to address barriers and support implementation? These are implementation strategies. So our definition, and I hate this definition, but I keep using it because it contains the word intervention. It makes it really confusing because intervention is the clinical or preventive intervention, not the strategy. So implementation strategies are changes or interventions on the system itself to increase adoption, right? In a recent review, 75 discrete evidence-informed strategies, not necessarily evidence-based, were recategorized using concept mapping into 9 broad categories. And these are things like engaging consumers, using evaluative and iterative strategies, changing the infrastructure within the inner context, adapting and tailoring the intervention and implementation strategies to a particular context, developing stakeholder interrelationships, using financial strategies supporting clinicians, all these different things, training and educating the stakeholders, all these different things that we obviously know have to happen for effectiveness studies to work and implementation, of course, to succeed, but this is just a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. Anybody want to venture a guess to how many, which one of these 9 categories has the most individual strategies? What do you think is absolutely necessary, but not sufficient? People usually do that, but not necessarily. No, well, that's probably true too, but it's developing stakeholder interrelationships. So having a stakeholder network, having the appropriate players all involved in a project is one of the biggest ways that either succeeds or fails. So that has the most available discrete strategies. Training and educating, adapting and tailoring, and supporting clinicians those are often also involved in a package of implementation strategies. But if you don't have stakeholder interrelationships, it's going to fail. Back in 2012, Byron Powell and colleagues had 6 other buckets that they used. They didn't use concept mapping. They basically just used sort of, the authors basically came up with this categorization. I like it because it's a little bit more action-oriented. So planning strategies, educating strategies, financing, restructuring, quality management, and policy context strategies. So a little bit more about these. So strategies are changes to the system to increase adoption. These are often theory or logic-driven connections between the strategy and the barriers. So we have all the determinants and barriers that we've identified using CIFR or something like that. So you have to basically try to line up conceptually and logically the strategies that you'll use to address those. This is just the same as you'd have in a behavior change intervention. If you're trying to address a certain behavior, you've got to have an intervention strategy or intervention approach that's going to address that thing, right? Not rocket science. There is actually a study that's published that's called the CIFR-ERIC matching study. They do have a tool that tries to help you narrow things down. Unfortunately, the conclusion was basically this didn't work very well. They got published, but it's not something to hang your hat on. And part of the reason is this. Use of strategies is rarely a one-to-one with the determinants of practice. So one strategy is often linked to multiple determinants, and one strategy is often used to address one barrier, more than one strategy is used to address one barrier. Increasing one implementation outcome could actually be the result of more than one determinant and require more than one strategy. So there's not a one-to-one, like, if you have this barrier, here's your strategy. It doesn't work like that. It really is a package. It's multi-level. It's multi-dimensional. Some characteristics of the strategy to report, but also keep in mind as you're trying to develop a study. You want to specify the actor who actually does it. What action do they perform? For what purpose? What's the target of that action? What timing? At what dose? What outcome is likely to be affected by that implementation strategy? And then is there a justification for its use? And the justification basically is preliminary data, existing data in the literature, that kind of a thing. Also be sure to measure fidelity of the strategy itself, especially in implementation where we might be actually doing like comparative implementation, where the only thing we're changing between arms in a study is the implementation strategy. We want to make sure that we actually adhered to the strategy to make sure that that's, in fact, why there was differences across arms. So how do we know if the strategy had the intended impact? This is our outcomes. So outcomes are defined as the deliberate and purposive actions to implement new treatments. So these can be indicators of implementation success. They can be proximal indicators of implementation processes, and they can also be key intermediate outcomes in relation to service or clinical outcomes. So the next slide will actually show that pictorially. Also pay attention to there are a lot of interactions among implementation research outcomes, and one good metric is actually the public health impact metric, which is the effect size of the intervention multiplied by its reach within the population. It's a really quick way of actually determining the population or public health impact of your implementation strategy. Oh, there's a figure on slide 27, just to keep you on the edge of your seat. So here's re-aim. This is the classic re-aim figure. So it's reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance. Re-aim has a fantastic website of how do you actually operationalize and measure each of these different things, as well as providing some citations. They don't actually have the measures themselves, but they do provide citations to a number of measures that you may consider using for each of these domains. So here's the slide 27 that I teased about. So this is essentially where implementation outcomes are in relation to clinical outcomes and service outcomes. So you start over here with an intervention strategy. So an intervention, one of those 7 Ps, that's evidence-based, of course. We then apply strategies to help adopt and implement that. To determine the impact, we have implementation strategies. That's the first thing that happens, is you impact implementation strategies. Those implementation strategies then determine how good of service outcomes you have, and the downstream effect is the clinical outcomes. So you can imagine that, actually, let me just skip. This is even better. So this is a slide I stole from Russ Glasgow. This is not my brainchild, unfortunately. It's really nice. So you have the evidence-based intervention within a delivery system. And in implementation, we're really concerned about a number of things. Can the program be adopted at all? Does someone actually pick it up and start to do it? If they do that, can they deliver it with a high enough level of fidelity that it's going to actually be effective for the clinic or for the client? Will the program actually reach the intended population? It's not sufficient enough to only offer it to 1 or 2 people within a 100-person population. That would not have a big impact. And then if you can reach those people, can you actually sustain it? So if you look at this mathematically, and we have a 50% uptake, so let's say we have a 0.5 effect size for our evidence-based intervention. We have a 50% threshold at each of these different levels within the delivery system. Who's got quick math? What's our overall population impact? I know it's really hard to multiply decimals. I used a calculator. It's 3%. Very nice back there, whoever said that. Nice. So yeah, 3% benefit if you actually are only able to achieve 50%, which is why each one of these pieces of the step is so important. Anybody want to do more quick math? What is it if you have a 0.8 threshold? It actually jumps up to over 30%. So it doesn't take a huge increase, but it takes a huge increase across each one of these steps to actually achieve a high level of population impact. So we often do shoot for an 80% threshold because it's pretty hard to achieve 100%, of course. So what does the strategy change to achieve the outcomes? This is really thinking about what's become a really important piece of implementation science as a field, is understanding the mechanisms of action. So mechanisms are processes or events through which an implementation strategy operates to affect desired implementation outcomes. It's the exact same kind of thing as an intervention mechanism. So how does an intervention strategy actually impact the outcome? There's something that's happening in between. And you can do a lot of different ways of looking at it. So here, looking at our little legend over on the side, we have, in this particular example, we have a determinant of practice actually changes a implementation strategy or determines what implementation strategy is used, which then comes back and changes another determinant. So it's the strategy itself that is the mechanism. In this example, we have an implementation outcome serving as our mediator between a strategy itself and a clinical outcome. So I'll give a couple of examples of these real world in a second. Here's another one and another one. Oh, that's a fun one. So that's got a multiple mediational process or a multiple intervening variable effect kind of an analysis. So here's a couple of examples of causal chains. So you have a strategy changing a determinant of practice that then changes an implementation outcome. So in this particular one, our implementation strategy is to incentivize, in some way, the use of an evidence-based intervention within a service delivery system. And we think if we incentivize, we're going to increase adoption rates. Duh, that should work. But how does it work? Why does it work? In this particular one, we think it's because it actually changed a determinant that the determinant was the relative advantage of the intervention is perceived as being higher than the alternative way of doing services. So if you incentivize, people say, oh, that has an advantage in my mind over something that's not incentivized, therefore I adopt. In our multiple intervening model, we have a strategy that changes two successive determinants, which changes an implementation outcome that leads to a change in another implementation outcome. So if we train and educate providers to deliver a program because we think it'll change delivery with fidelity, how does that actually happen? If you train people well, they'll increase their knowledge, they have increased self-efficacy, and hopefully it increases the perceived acceptability of the intervention that they've then adopted, which leads to better delivery with fidelity. I will tell you right now, there are very few examples of this kind of work in the literature. There was a review done that only identified about 5 articles that statistically measured mediators. And I think it was 15 or so articles that talked about one of the paths, so either the A or the B path, but didn't actually do formal mediation to test this mechanism. So this is really how do we put this all together? How do we plan, specify, and report implementation research? This is the implementation research logic model that I'm developing with a couple of colleagues and presented at the DNI conference last year. So the development of the project, or the logic model, it's based on the pipeline model that everyone's familiar with, that like CDC and AHRQ often like require in part of their grant proposals. This is like a traditional evaluation framework or evaluation logic model. So what the intention was, though, is to leverage existing frameworks, models, and taxonomies, but then to integrate them in a new way to really help people see how the pieces fit together. Pilot work was done, and again, this is to be really useful. We think this should be principled use, not rule governed. So we provide principles, not rules, for how to actually use this. And here's my other disclaimer. George Box famously said, essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I hope this is useful, even if you think it's wrong. So logic models in general, I don't know. You have this in your slides. So the elements are exactly what we just talked about. Determinants of practice, implementation strategies, the mechanism of action, and the outcomes. You can create easy causal chains between this, logically as well as testable. So here's what the actual logic model looks like. So we have determinants over here on the left side. This is basically equivalent to inputs within the traditional pipeline model. It's all the things in the context that are going to determine whether or not you're successful. So you can see this is CFIR. This is the 5 buckets of CFIR: process, characteristics of individuals, outer and inner context, and the intervention characteristics. You have implementation strategies, which you can do whatever you want, but pull from Powell or something using conventional naming techniques so that we don't create new terms and a whole bunch of different things out there in the world. Then we have our mechanisms box. How do those actual strategies change the implementation outcomes? And if you look at this kind of sideways, just tilt a little bit, this is the Proctor model. So it's implementation outcomes leading to service outcomes, which lead to downstream clinical practice outcomes. In a pure implementation trial, you don't necessarily get to clinical and patient outcomes. What is actually here is a hybrid. So this is actually measuring both implementation and clinical patient. So here's a couple of variations. We coined the term comparative implementation, very analogous to comparative effectiveness, where you're comparing 2 bona fide implementation strategies against one another with the same evidence-based intervention. So hopefully you have then the same primary outcomes, but there's a potential that your implementation strategies differ, and that's by design, as well as having potentially the mechanisms of action being slightly different. So you may want to specify for strategy condition 1 and strategy condition 2, here's how the strategies differ if you're doing comparative implementation. But in most cases, your implementation outcome should be the same, and then your clinical patient outcomes should be the same, because the only independent variable that you're manipulating is the strategy, right? Here's another example for a multi-context implementation, and this actually came up a couple of weeks ago in our Ending the HIV Epidemic training, where someone said, well, how do I use this if I'm trying to link services across 2 different service contexts? Like, easy. I don't know. I don't know if it was that easy, but I had an idea pretty quickly that split the determinants. So specify the different contextual factors and determinants across each of the 2 contexts, because they can be very different. This particular project was actually working with a community-based or a public health-based service organization that would partner with CVS and Walgreens pharmacies. So you have the health department and you have the pharmacies themselves that have their own contextual determinants. The other thing that's true too is you're going to also have different strategies. that they're going to be used because they are basically responsible for different parts of the overall intervention program. So this is just a way of really helping us specify, report, and also plan what we are actually going to do. So some guiding principles kind of quickly here. Wanting to include all relevant determinants and strategies, so it's not just the strategies that you think you're going to change or manipulate as part of your study, but what other strategies does the organization already use? And part of this is to really help us show comprehensiveness, transparency, rigor, but also have alternative explanations. This is particularly true in a null trial, if it doesn't work. Why did it not work? But also showing that here it might be the reason why it did work is that there's all this other stuff happening. That's why it can't be replicated. Also indicate or notate relationship between the elements. So when we have like those causal paths and you're trying to show logic for why you picked the strategies you did based on the determinants that you have, you can use color coding or subscript. And I'll show you an example of this in a little bit. If you have an independent variable strategy, so if you have a strategy you're manipulating, label it. Note the primary outcome at each level. Or operationalize the outcome if space allows. And this is really just to help people obviously look at your trial very quickly in a one-pager. And then for a comparative implementation, there's a few additional things that we've already kind of talked about. So here's a very basic example application of the logic model. Some folks have probably seen this. This is an urban healthcare system wanting to increase PrEP prescribing, so pre-exposure prophylaxis. So everyone knows what PrEP is probably to some extent. Basically, if taken consistently, PrEP will basically reduce the risk of a new HIV infection in high-risk populations by over 90%. There's guidelines available, and we know that delivery is a little challenging. There's a number of things that make it a little hard. You have to do repeat HIV testing, you have to provide a prescription, refill authorization, every 6 months assessing renal failure and conducting additional STI testing, and HIV testing, obviously, to make sure the person's still negative. So it's not an easy administration, even though it seems like it should be. It's just a pill, but it's not just a pill. And then adherence is obviously a huge issue. You have to take it consistently, daily, essentially, to have it be effective. So the premise here is that a large health system with a lot of clinics in a high prevalence urban area, high HIV prevalence urban area wants to increase their PrEP uptake. So the leaders in the health system decided they are going to engage with an implementation scientist to compare whether referring potentially eligible patients to the specialty STI HIV clinic in the community for PrEP or providing PrEP within the clinic will result in better outcomes. You can probably already think about what's required to do these different things, right? So here's the research question. Does training primary care physicians to identify and prescribe PrEP as part of routine preventive care lead to provider adoption and to reaching more individuals compared to referring them to specialty STI HIV clinics? It's a little wordy. It's intentional, so I can show you this. Here are our implementation strategies. We have training, and we have identifying and prescribing PrEP as part of routine practice. So we have basically routinization and workflow change, as well as training our implementation strategies. It's also our independent variable, just to note that. We also have our implementation outcomes, so provider adoption is a primary outcome, as well as reach. Yay, outcomes. And then we also have essentially what is going to be our comparison-based trial design. So we have within our research question how we are actually going to do this work. So here's some example of specific aims if you were going to write this up as a study. Your aims might be to train the primary care physicians to identify and prescribe, increase primary care provider adoption of PrEP screening and prescribing, identify effective practice for reaching PrEP eligible patients. And this is really, is it better to integrate or to refer? Hypotheses are exactly what you would think, that provider, clinic, and PrEP-related factors will be related to primary care physician adoption. Training can overcome these potential barriers is our hypothesis. That's why we're using it as our primary strategy. Oh, sorry. Improving leadership support of provider delivery of PrEP will also increase its rate of adoption. And then providing PrEP in primary care will lead to more prescriptions than referring out because of that issue of following through with referrals, going to another provider to establish care, all those different things. So our metrics, we've already said that adoption and reach are going to be our two primary. Operationalizing them, our providers would prescribe PrEP. That's our adoption metric. And reach would be the proportion of eligible patients that are actually prescribed PrEP. We also might be interested, again, from our hypotheses and our specific aims in assessing a few other implementation outcomes. So acceptability, we thought, would be a potential mechanism of why training would actually work and increase their adoption. So we get providers' perspective of adoption, of acceptability. We get the appropriateness, which is provider and patient's perspectives of, is it appropriate to actually have PrEP within primary care? Some people don't like that, both on the provider and patient level. Feasibility. Does it increase the time that physicians spend with patients? Does it increase wait times? Does it allow them to serve or not serve as many patients? And is cost actually a cost beneficial or cost neutral, or even potentially a revenue increasing thing for the practice? So here's what our logic model might look like. You have this in your handout, so I'm going to go pretty quick, and you can just take a look at, this is, again, a hypothetical example, so I made up all this stuff. It may be completely illogical in reality, but for illustrative purposes, it works. So you can see the color coding within our strategies, and I've used this plus-minus system to show as a plus, it's a facilitator. As a plus-minus, it's either neutral or it varies across the different clinics, or as a negative, it's a barrier. It's a clear barrier for this particular context. So we selected these strategies, and we've already talked about these. So we have training providers and staff. And the reason that we do training is that we have potential issues with adherence, with commitment, with self-efficacy, potential barriers with stigma. All these different factors within the determinants are dictating that particular strategy. You can carry this through to the mechanism and to the outcomes. So if we're gonna increase provider adoption, which you can see I dual color coded because there's two causal pathways that end at adoption. If we're going to improve adoption through training, it's because we're increasing providers' knowledge about PrEP guidelines. Remember my multi-thing example? Yeah, it's that, basically. So you can kind of follow this little logic. Again, this is a hypothetical, not a great example probably too. Here's a couple of service outcomes that may be really relevant, as well as our clinical outcomes would be, the percent of people who actually fill their first prescription, the percent who end up being adherent to PrEP, and then PrEP refill percentages, whether or not you were actually able to reduce the number of STIs and HIV infections. So all those things that we would be typically interested in an effectiveness study, but we're adding all this additional layer onto understanding the system itself that supports getting to those clinical outcomes. As you can imagine, if you're trying to write this in a proposal or as a paper in a manuscript reporting the findings of a study, you'll need additional materials. So this is just some guidance on where you might be able to put additional materials. Here's some feedback. I'm not going to read it. This was solicited. I was part of this project. Take it for what you will. Some strengths and limitations. I think this is fairly obvious. One of the strengths is it's a 1 to 2 page visual depiction of a very complicated project often. It can help us really increase transparency and comprehensiveness of what often is a very complex process. And it's really hard to describe, and even implementation scientists who appreciate the complexity, when you're writing a manuscript that has a 4,000 word limit, you only can go into so much detail. It provides a common structure to increase consistency and transparency. It also aids in demonstrating rigor and reproducibility components, which, as you know, are scored aspects of NIH grants now. Clearer specification of links and pathways to actually test theories. That's one of the reasons why this whole mechanisms of implementation has received attention is we haven't done a good job of testing our theories in this field. We use them, but we don't necessarily test and show that it was that. It's a really good tool for academic practice, collaboration, and partnership development. So it could actually be conceived of as one of those strategies for developing stakeholder interrelationships or helping to improve partnerships or develop partnerships. It can also be used to plan and track process over time. So the vision really is, too, that you might have a logic model for your proposal that then changes during the course of doing the implementation because new barriers emerge. New strategies have to be used to address barriers that you didn't think were a problem when conceiving the study, but then really were when you got in there. And then you also have one that's the final reporting of the study, what actually happened, not what we proposed and we think is going to happen, but what actually happened. Some negatives. It's a simplified format, so it has to balance depth and detail. You can't provide a lot of depth, which is why those supporting materials are really important to provide the depth and detail. And also, it may inhibit creative thinking if applied too rigidly, which is why when we actually get a paper out on this, providing a whole bunch of different examples of how you can adapt and use the logic model for your context or for your study itself. And that's why I kind of gave those comparative implementation, multi-context, those kinds of examples. There will be more. So how do we actually test implementation? So here's some study designs. Here's the paper to go to. This is an overview of research and evaluation designs, in which they kind of threw all major designs. And this is mostly for experimental and quasi-experimental studies, by the way. I'll talk a little bit about alternative approaches in a second, but we have basically 3 big buckets: within site designs, between site designs, and then within and between site designs. So within site designs, this is really to evaluate change in a single site, where you have, and site is, it really should be a single unit. What is your unit? We're doing studies that have a single unit at a community level that has potentially thousands of participants, but it really is an N of 1 study. So it's huge, but it's one. Your site might also be a 4-provider rural primary care clinic. That, it really can span the gamut, but it's really that you only have one kind of main unit. This can demonstrate feasibility and initial impact. These are rarely randomized, but using kind of single case experimental designs and multiple baseline kinds of designs, you can randomize multiple single units or providers within a single unit. These are really simple and useful designs. They are typically used to generate local knowledge as opposed to generalizable knowledge, for which you need to have repeated assessment and multiple sites. So 3 examples that we give are post designs, where you only measure your implementation outcomes and outputs after the new EBP is adopted. This is where you don't have the service before. So let's say you're not providing prep at all, and then you're like, well, we need to evaluate if prep works. Well, there's no pre, so you just do a post design to show after a period of time, here's what we've been able to achieve. Pre-post design is where you have usually a clinical gap or a problem that you notice, so you infuse implementation strategies to improve that particular implementation and clinical outcome, and you do a pre-post to be able to demonstrate that. And then you can do all sorts of interrupted time series where you use single unit experiments, potentially with multiple baselines, to do, when you do repeated measurement. Oh, that's a paper that I wrote in 2012. It's in the references if anyone's interested. It's a really nice crash course into like the basics of single case experimental design, which is the only reason I leave it in there. So for between site designs, this is when you compare outcomes between 2 or more sites or 2 or more units. So you compare the impact of different implementation strategies across sites or groups of sites. This can contribute to generalizable knowledge. So really the most common of these is to compare a novel implementation strategy versus routine practice, so implementation as usual. You can do randomized or non-randomized versions of this, which would be quasi or fully experimental. You can do head-to-head randomized trials, which are also what we call comparative implementation, where you compare 2 novel implementation strategies for the exact same clinical preventive intervention, as we've already talked about a little bit. A couple of lesser used but also useful designs, and I can't go into detail about this, but I'll show a resource at the end where you can find more about it. Incomplete block designs, where you have few units available, as well as smart designs. Everyone's probably heard of smart at this point, or other kinds of factorial designs like most or fractional factorial, those kinds of things. So those get used a lot. The difference here is you're not comparing different components of the intervention. The intervention stays the same. You're comparing different elements of implementation strategies, so different combinations of different strategies over time rather than different intervention pieces. Then we have these between and within site rollout designs, which rollout designs are a big broad class, and these are where sites begin as one implementation condition and then move to another at usually an investigator, manipulator, or defined time point. So rollout designs, which include stepped wedge, I'm sure everyone's heard of a stepped wedge, they all assign units randomly to when and to what implementation strategy is going to be used. These are really useful in implementation research because they reduce logistic demands in delivering new strategies across multiple units as you're doing it over time rather than 100 clinics at the same time. You can look at equity, where do people benefit earlier versus later starting? We can test for that. These are also beneficial to statistical power because you're using both between and within site comparisons at the same time. It also can control for contemporal confounders. So if you think about a stepped wedge, at any given point, you have, or at most given points in a stepped wedge, you have clinics who are in the experimental condition and in control. So you can always, if something happens, some crazy policy change or natural disaster, things that would really change potentially the implementation, you can look at how that affected everything moving forward and have both the within and between. In a true, full, regular trial, it would mess up everybody. There's some other designs for implementation research. This is an invited paper for a special issue in JCTS, Clinical and Translational Science. So I expect it'll get published, but who knows, maybe it never will. We talk about also observational designs where the investigator doesn't intervene at all. You just instead describe the outcomes of interest and their antecedents within the natural context of implementation. A lot of modeling happens, simulation modeling as well as agent-based modeling. Typically involves just simulating the addition or configuration of implementation strategies to determine which path should be taken in the real world. These are great because, as you can imagine, really large implementation studies are very expensive. So being able to either narrow down what's going to happen or to potentially, if implementation is going to happen regardless and you can't test it, you could model how it should be done to hopefully make it as impactful as possible. It can also be used to test the likely impact of implementing one or more evidence-based interventions. So if you're looking at combo interventions, you can look at what the best combination is for the best people, or for the right people in certain contexts, and actually map that out. And there's another thing called configural comparative methods, which is like qualitative comparative analysis and things like that. And this combines within case analysis and logic-based cross-case analysis to identify determinants and outcomes of implementation. And they use this thing called the INUS, or INUS, where they identify causal relationships that are insufficient but necessary, part of a condition that is itself unnecessary but sufficient. Just read it 7 or 8 times. You'll get it. So here's hybrid designs. I'm going to eat in a little bit of our time, so I'm going to go a little bit over, but I've been told I'm okay to do that.
You're good.
So effectiveness implementation hybrid designs are a bit of a special case. So the definition really is a simultaneous evaluation, just like it says, of effectiveness of the clinical intervention and of its implementation. So this naturally involves more than 2 levels or 2 or more levels of data collection. You usually have patient-level data, and you also have system-level data for implementation. The emphasis on effectiveness or implementation differentiates these hybrid types, but really it's a continuum, like you see below. So you could place your study anywhere on that, but for a helpful kind of heuristic, we have 3 different types. So type 2 is really where you are equally balanced and have co-primary aims around one is effectiveness and one on implementation. Over here, which is probably where folks are probably most comfortable at this point if you're more of a traditional clinical trialist, is to do a predominantly effectiveness study, but then observe and document the implementation as you go to then inform implementation later on. So in that case, you're not usually manipulating the strategy, but you're really just kind of observing and adding implementation measurement to what is largely an effectiveness study. On the other side of things, we have type 3, which is predominantly interested in the implementation, but you still want to collect effectiveness data to make sure that you're hitting the clinical outcome. And there's reasons to do this, of course. Sometimes it's just purely funder-driven. Other times, you're moving into a new context or you're scaling up at such a rate that you want to make sure that we're not getting beyond essentially the evidence. And you want to show for sure that in this particular kind of a large implementation trial, we still move the outcome. This also allows you to look at interrelationships between implementation outcomes and the clinical effectiveness. So getting back to that idea of the public health impact or different kind of ways of slicing and dicing levels of fidelity, levels of adoption, that kind of thing. I'm going to skip this one, but you have it. So here's application and purpose of each type. So again, type 1 determines the effectiveness of the intervention as the primary aim. The secondary aim is to understand the context for implementation. You're not changing implementation, but you're understanding the context and describing. In a type 2, you have this cool little double arrow that's basically co-primary aims. It's not primary, secondary. So under the effectiveness, you have determining the effectiveness of the intervention as well as determining the feasibility and or impact of the implementation strategy. And then in type 3, your primary aim is the impact of the implementation strategy, and then assessing clinical outcomes associated with implementation. As you can imagine, in a type 3, we don't use gold standard clinical effectiveness measures. So if you're doing mental health, you're not using a SCID to do a formal diagnosis. It's fine to pull EHR record and say, there's a depression diagnosis in the record. That's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to still show that you're moving the needle on the effectiveness outcome. A couple other things down here below. You might use a type 1 or type 2 when the effectiveness of the intervention itself has yet to be fully established. So this is a way of skipping steps. You're allowed to backfill effectiveness data when testing implementation strategies. So this is basically if you have maybe not perfect or full effectiveness data, you can do a hybrid, collect the effectiveness data, and backfill it. So it's another way of kind of skipping a step in the traditional translational pipeline. Use a type 2 or 3 when the relationship between implementation and effectiveness is unknown, or it's hypothesized to occur. So if you expect that there's going to be an interaction between 2 different implementation strategies and the effect on outcomes, it's a good time to do a type 2 or type 3. I don't have time to get into power and level of randomization, but these are key considerations, and as you can imagine, these can be kind of complicated at times. Here's a cool continuum of implementation research that is in that AIDS and Behavior article that is in your packet, and this is also what we'll use for the small group breakout here in a little bit, so pay attention if you've been snoozing or checking your email recently. These combine implementation research questions or the aims of an implementation study with the study design that you'll use to test it. And it really is, it's a continuum because it's sort of developmental. It's where are you within kind of the movement from, kind of moving from effectiveness to implementation to comparative implementation. So we define two kind of big stages, and this aligns with the EPIS model. So when you're preparing for implementation, this is research that's in preparation for formal evaluation or testing of the strategy. Your research aim or question might be something around studies to understand the implementation processes or barriers, facilitators that exist in your context. Studies to explore the feasibility or the acceptability of a strategy that you might use. It might be a study to develop or tailor an implementation strategy. Adapting an evidence-based intervention is itself application of a strategy. Adaptation is a strategy, so that could be where you're at. Modeling that has the potential to inform implementation research is often in this preparation phase because you're not formally testing. Studies that basically, so the three places where this would fall in the continuum is the first one would be identify barriers, facilitators, identify, select, develop, adapt implementation strategies, add a couple more in there, whatever you want to do to implementation strategies. And then 3 would be to pilot test it. So an underpowered study that really is looking at the acceptability, feasibility, and initial impact, but not full impact of a strategy itself. The implementation research on the other side, which is our second bucket, these are kind of back to that NIH definition of trials that are designed to evaluate the implementation strategy itself. So these are like more formal tests. And you have two. You have evaluating the impact of one strategy or one bundle of strategies, usually compared to implementation as usual. Or you have comparative implementation, where you're doing head-to-head randomized trial. Oh, yeah, small groups, pay attention. So here is what this continuum looks like, and this is also the results of this recent AIDS and behavior systematic review. So if you didn't have a chance to at least peruse the abstract, what we did is we looked at 5 years of the NIH portfolio in HIV and implementation research, identified 216 studies that were both in the field of HIV and were doing implementation research, and we coded the crap out of them. And what we found when we applied the continuum coding is that we had about a 50% split between people in the implementation preparation side versus those in the implementation research side. And you can see the breakdown here as well. So a small proportion were only concerned with barriers and facilitators. That was the only thing they were doing. A lot of them were doing developmental kind of studies, and this falls into that sort of developing, adapting, testing, tailoring, an implementation strategy without doing a whole lot with it. Then we have a group of pilot studies. And you can see here that I've crossed out, and I'm going to X out as we go, bad people. If you don't use an implementation outcome, it's not implementation research. You can call it whatever you want, but it's not implementation research. And we saw an alarming abundance of studies that were funded that did not have explicit implementation outcomes. So don't be that person. But we do see, again, pilot studies with implementation outcomes. When we move into implementation research, we saw a large number of studies that do this implementation as usual versus our implementation strategy or strategy package. And then we saw a fair number, actually, of comparative implementations. But unfortunately, within that, you see that it was almost double the proportion were not measuring outcomes at the implementation level, which is really strange. So they were basically effectiveness studies, they were basically implementation comparative studies pitched as effectiveness study designs. So they still were only looking at clinical outcomes with none of those implementation outcomes, even though the intervention was actually an implementation strategy. So it's just a funny mismatch that appeared way more than we thought it would. So yeah, don't do that. Some IR resources just to kind of wrap us up here. This is in your packet, and we're going to get these posted also on the CFAR Dissemination Implementation website that you saw earlier. So TIDER and TIDIRC are great NIH sources. TIDIRC just recently released their course as an online free course in the last few weeks. So it's self-guided, but all the materials are there. There's lectures, PowerPoint slides, all that stuff. Anybody who's in the NIMH, NIDA, or mental health, substance use, HIV field in the VA might look at applying to the Implementation Research Institute or the IRI. There's also a certificate program at UCSF, which I've heard a lot of people here are either in or have done. There's also the NCI DNI webinar series, which happens about monthly. They call it the Fireside Chat series. And if you've ever been on that, David Chambers actually puts up a loop video of a fire, and it's like you're supposed to be sitting around a fire. It's really funny. And there's a whole bunch of articles, measures, news, other stuff. I have one plug that I'll give here in a second, but all the rest of these are really, really useful resources. If you want more kind of implementation science training and don't mind seeing and hearing my voice a little bit more, We have a Implementation Science 101 introductory workshop. This was done in collaboration with our Center for AIDS Research, so this uses HIV examples. We also did a follow-up, which is really a deep dive. So I had 5 or 6 slides on designs. This is a 90-minute on designs. So this is mostly Hendrix and myself, and then Nanette Benbow, who's a really great public health HIV researcher who's gotten into implementation science, also helped us with this. So if you want to look at different kinds of trial designs, it's a way to go. Here's my plug. The Prevention Science and Methodology Group, which has been in existence for 25, 26 years, we now have nearly 1,000 members. It's free to join. It's NIH sponsored. We have every single year a series. So we do usually 3 or 4 series. We have had an implementation science series for the last 5 years. This happens every Tuesday at noon to 1:30. But then there's also a online repository of all recorded talks. So if you can't make that time or you want to just peruse back through, there's talks from David Chambers, Enola Proctor, Ross Brownson, Russ Glasgow, Jeff Curran. I mean, everybody you've heard who's a good implementation scientist has probably done something over the last few years. So it's a fantastic resource. Again, it's free to join. We don't barrage you too much with emails, and you can join by sending an email to psmg@northwestern.edu. So a couple concluding thoughts. D&I science is really intended to help us realize the potential of investments that we and NIH has made in innovating and discovery. It doesn't mean a whole lot if we can't actually move those things out to people that can benefit from them. One other thing that I didn't have a chance to talk about, but I wanted to emphasize, is that you can't really start thinking about D&I only after you've done your effectiveness study. So when you're moving through that pipeline, if you're sort of thinking about it in silos, you're likely to run into a really hard roadblock. So you must begin thinking about implementation and dissemination actually in pre-intervention and efficacy stages of the pipeline. And there's some really good resources where there are things like, they call it like designing for dissemination, or designing for implementation. Also a really nice new study, or a paper, I guess, that was in JCTS called DART, which is designing for accelerated translation. But this is really the idea that you need to start thinking about all the capacity, resources, and ability to disseminate much earlier in the process. Yeah, it can help you speed translation, hybrid designs, using DART, those kinds of things can help us lessen this 17-year problem. And then in order to do this work, there really needs to be a capacity for implementation science that you build at your university or that you build across universities, where you really need knowledge in implementation science, you need experience, people who have done it, whether or not they've done it as a card-carrying implementation scientist or they just know what to do when they get out there. So this is involving community partners too. You need interdisciplinary teams. So constantly we have content experts, we have experts in the context, we have health economists, we have modelers, we have people from all sorts of different places. We even bring in people from business to talk about the actual economic and business aspects of these things. And then building those academic community partnerships, as I kind of have stressed, is really, really critical. And here's a bunch of references. That's it. Actually, wasn't that
Before jumping into questions, I'm going to come back to my highlighted sheet. I just want to point out, JD finished his doctoral degree in 2011, and his doctoral degree was in clinical psychology at a place well known to Dean Irwin, UT Knoxville. So it's just amazing to see someone from the psychology world moving into this space of IS and very rapidly moving through the ranks as an associate professor at Northwestern, and I think speaks to team science. As you were talking, I think I'm looking around the room thinking about folks, with the mediation analysis, thinking about psychology and sociology and other areas, nursing certainly, causal inference and epidemiological sciences, simulation modeling. So if nothing else, I hope that JD's tour de force talk, I'm still looking at the fire hose at 50% and multiplying 50 by 50 by 50 and hoping we get more than 3% ultimately. But just thinking about how much this hopefully is more approachable. I think a lot of folks think about IS being off on its own, and it's really not. I mean, folks that have trained in these other disciplines, be it psychology or otherwise, hopefully this is now feels a little bit more approachable in your work going forward. So I want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, of course.
It's amazing.
And just want to also point out too that you can see the funding and grant support. I think I'm on 10 or 11 funded projects, but it's not all from the same place. So there's implementation research interest as well as money available from a lot of different places. To be totally honest, some of these were like hybrid type ones where we really slipped in some good implementation stuff, but still, that's grantsmanship. Like everyone does that. So it's a way to find some other sources.
Dr. Say.
Well done. So it feels to me like the biomedical research community is late to the party for implementation, thinking military, right?
Sure.
Go back to Rochambeau and Lafayette, right? They were strategizing on how to implement victory or move people around and that type of thing. Retail.
Yeah.
Right? They've been doing implementation science for over a century, probably.
Yes.
When you walk into Bloomingdale's, how do you present stuff to sell it? So what can we learn from those experiences? Go to West Point, or what do we do? How do you apply, seriously, how can we take lessons learned from those domains and apply it to make our life easier?
So I really like the example of marketing and like consumer science. So one thing that they're really good at is rapid knowledge acquisition to figure out what people are interested in buying. It happens so fast.
Yeah.
So these like micro trials, there was a really great example that was given at the NIH D&I conference, and I wish I remembered the guy's name to give him credit. But they basically were looking at feasibility of a new kind of implementation strategy for getting like, it was something about getting connected with physicians around a particular problem, right? And one of the problems they had was access. Like if you were on the list, it would take you weeks to get a response. So they said, well, what if we just had a hotline? Like had a number to call that you'd immediately get to a person. This is genius. All they did was they put up an announcement on some university site that would clearly come up with keywords. They actually put the office number of the primary physician who was involved in the study, and they only left it up for 3 days just to see how many people would call. They got 38 calls in 3 days just from advertising. And you don't need a trial to understand that this strategy will work. Like people will respond to this kind of an approach to get access to services. So they didn't need funding for that. They didn't need anything to do that. So we need to be a little bit better about using these kind of alternative or non-scientific, or maybe I shouldn't say non-scientific, but things that are outside of the traditional scientific realm to learn about implementation and how things can get, especially dissemination, how we can create pull from consumers. So I think there are definitely a lot of lessons to be learned.
So from Bloomingdale's to Nordstrom's to Amazon in less than 17 years. How do we?
I'm sure Amazon can teach us a lot too, honestly. Yeah.
This may be a naive question, but I see CDC and HRSA listed on your funding.
Yeah.
And how are you fitting sort of the research aspect into some of the funding agencies where even when you get a grant funded by the CDC,
Yeah.
at least my experience has been, I like too much, like NIH, then when I put it in at CDC, they're like, oh, we gotta change this, like, we like your project and you're funded, but we're gonna change your wording 12 times over to make sure that you fit within the no research. So I just wonder if you can kind of speak to that.
Yeah,
as far as
I should asterisk the
implementation science
CDC
goes.
one. Is this was actually a research grant. It was
Okay.
not a traditional CDC grant. It was a congressional appropriation for research projects. So that we
And HRSA too can be a little bit that way, right?
yeah, HRSA is a SPINS grant, and so it actually is around capacity building. It is more in the formative research where we're actually developing implementation toolkits for evidence-based programs that didn't exist, and doing implementation cost analysis that also didn't exist. So it's more in that implementation preparation side of things, rather than an actual formal test like a trial or something along those lines. But we explicitly wrote in we're gonna use implementation research to do this stuff to hopefully help people adopt and implement. And it was not balked at. In fact, obviously we got funded, so somebody liked it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it wasn't the main part of the proposal, but it was we didn't have to kind of hide it in any way.
I want to ask a question, if I could, just quickly about I love the logic model. I hadn't seen that, so really appreciated your logic model.
Yeah, new thing for you.
And was just thinking through it in the context of the other parts of the talk, does it need to be CFR and Proctor? I mean, could you plug in another deterministic framework and evaluation framework and apply that model and kind of choose different things that better fit your science?
Absolutely. So I only use CFR and then REAIM and Proctor because it's the thing people are most familiar with. But again, it's supposed to be a principle-driven and not a rule-governed approach. So yeah, it just means use a model for determinants. There's a bunch of other ones besides CFR. Use an outcome evaluation framework. If you're using a process model that includes some of those other things, you can obviously borrow from that as well. So EPIS, actually, I didn't mention this, they actually have inner and outer context as part of their model. So they have determinants within their process model. You could maybe actually get rid of CFR and just use EPIS for both determinants and process. So It's meant to be very flexible. It's meant to really provide a scaffold that you fill in to meet your purposes. And it really is supposed to be to help you plan, to communicate, and hopefully for reviewers to get a sense of your project a little bit more quickly. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, so thank you, JD. One example given in the textbook that you refer to, Brownson's textbook on implementation science, and I'm hesitant to use this example given who's in the room, but it's an example of the compression of the 17-year time frame.
Yeah.
First AIDS cases in 81, the AIDS virus discovered in 84, AZT in 87, and highly effective therapy in 96.
Yeah.
And at least as described in the text, the one element that made that compression possible was political will.
Yes.
How do you figure that into your logic model?
It's a determinant of practice in the outer context. So it really is there political support for this? Are there policies in place that support it? Policies in general, so it could be payer policies. So PrEP is a great example, and I don't know if you guys have probably paid attention to the casing. Was it California where they brought the case up? They're basically pointing out that PrEP is like $40,000 a month for most people or something crazy like that. A lot of insurance doesn't cover it, but yet there's all these other countries that have it available for like $400 a month. And people have done modeling that if you change the policy or were able to negotiate with payers to bring it down, that our reach would basically quadruple, quintuple, like almost overnight. There's still issues of acceptability, of actually reaching the people and informing them about it, but there are these big policy implications that if we had the appropriate policies and political will, that it can move things along. And PrEP is actually a really good example of how we actually have a slide that I didn't include where it shows the PrEP timeline of when PrEP was developed, tested in efficacy, tested in effectiveness, and then CDC created a policy and started funding people to deliver it before effectiveness was even fully established. So there is ways that policy and political will does actually compress the pipeline. But there's other places where it makes it much harder, and it actually probably elongates the pipeline. So that's a really great point.
So when I look at this, the logic model again,
Yeah.
Determinants, strategies, mechanisms, outcomes, it seems very analogous to quality improvement science, like drivers and barriers, structure,
Yeah.
process, outcomes. So can you delineate those two as different kinds of science? Are they very similar?
Well, I think you get into that improvement science place where hopefully, and it also, again, it depends a little bit on your scope and your purpose. So if your scope is really to figure out how to make something work in just your one clinic that you work with here in town, it probably is more of a CQI, quality improvement based approach. If you're designing a study that's testing and trying to create generalizable knowledge, you're probably going to pull more from the implementation research world. But the improvement science is really the best of both of those. So doing kind of a CQ local knowledge generation, but pulling from hopefully the literature and implementation science that could maybe inform it in a way that's got a little bit more evidence. But sure, it doesn't necessarily have to be for an NIH grant. It could be a fairly small scale project.
Yeah, now I'm going to fashion myself an improvement. Thank you for that.
Improvement scientist? Yeah, there you go. A new card to carry.
That's what I am. Good, thank you. I didn't even realize it, but that's so good. I got like a new thing to say. So again, I think we want to thank JD tremendously for being here in the last couple of days and being with us.